process about practical aspects of just building a real application. So this is just what I've learned along the way, most recently actually. So what I've been trying to do, as I mentioned, build a real app, and I want rich client behavior. What I needed for my particular, and I'll show you later, but for my particular use case was an interactive spreadsheet like a grid that could represent hierarchical data. Similar to what you might see in Google spreadsheets, but a little more specialized, not generic like a generic spreadsheet, but rows and columns with some ways to expand and collapse and other specialized behaviors. And I've finally got to this point with the app where I can serve the data up, and I'm like, well, how do I do this? I could render the data, but now I needed to actually interact with it. So it seemed a little daunting at first. So specifically, there are at least 3 levels of hierarchy here: people, projects, and tasks, which I'll get into later. Columns represent calendar weeks. And I needed to be able to navigate and select like you do in a spreadsheet. So specifically, click a cell, range of cells, edit those cells, you know, but somewhat restrictive and only the things that make sense. So how to render complex data. So this is a bit about UX design and, well, interaction design, because you can build anything, but it's got to be usable. So that was part of this whole process. It has to be intuitive, right? I mean, you have to be able to look at the thing and go, I kind of know how to use it. Otherwise, it doesn't really serve a purpose. So I will get into this real quickly. The dog fooding, I always thought that was a weird term, but I understand the original reference to it. But it is really, really super important. I've built applications, worked in application teams for a long time, bridge between development and customers and product management. And if you won't use it, probably nobody else will. And this is something you kind of have to learn the hard way too, because you think, oh, if I build this thing, it'll be great, somebody will use it. But you start building something, and it takes a while, at least I found, before I would really, really use it. I started building this thing a long time ago, but even I would sit there and go, well, it's kind of cumbersome. Would I really use it day to day? It took really getting to this point of making it interactive in the way that made sense to me, where I'm really now starting to use it. So getting back to this, representing this hierarchical data. I don't know if you tried to build apps or used apps like this where you get these embedded tables, and they're really hard to read, right? When you try to represent hierarchical data, it's just kind of tough. And if you can't look at it and kind of make sense of it really quick, it's a struggle. So what I did was went flat in the sense of sort of denormalizing this and getting all the data laid out very clearly with ways to tag it and understand what it was, but without getting the columns are kind of shifted off, and it really just had to be lined up very clean and straight. So how to build it. So now we're talking about how to construct this thing basically in HTML. But I wanted to get kind of a conceptual rendering of this, where there are these rows of data. Each one is done by divs. And I didn't use tables, actually. This is probably my 3rd or 4th iteration of the app. First I started with tables, but I found it kind of weird at times because I needed very specific rendering alignment. I didn't want fluid layouts and adjustments, and I found that tables are great for all that, but once you want to go very fixed and precise, they didn't really work that great. So everything's done with divs, but there's multiple levels now where we've got rows of divs, each one representing what is kind of a person. I'll get to more details, but there are these multiple levels, but they're all laid out flat. So getting to where it's, what I'm going to show you in a bit, there is this custom directive called grid editor. And it is specifically looking for child elements that are tagged in this particular way. So what you're seeing here is the logical representation of the editor grid, and this is going to be a custom directive that can manipulate things inside of here. But it has to know what it's looking for, so everything has to be tagged the right way, like we've talked about, very declarative. DOM, location, and navigation. So this was the fun part. I don't know who has actually played around with DOM and manipulating. Anyone? I mean, kind of fun. But it's different. You have to really navigate up and down and know what, how jQuery works and how you're going to find stuff. So let's talk a little bit about one case where you're trying to navigate around. So let's say you're using the arrow key and you're going right. Well, how do you identify the next cell in the DOM tree Well, there's actually multiple cases you have to even think about to do that because it depends on where you're navigating in the tree. You could be in the middle here, you're going to the next one over. You could be at the last cell in the row, which means what if you want to, which is what I did, I wanted to wrap around and go here. Well, how do you do that wrap around? It's not automatic, you got to navigate there. What if you're at the very end of what is another part of the hierarchy? You've got to figure out what to do there. So, it's really not that hard once you kind of crack open manipulating elements or looking at elements. So in this case, if you know the cell you're at and you want to basically move over, and this is inside the directive and you've got access to the element, you can then start doing things like, in this case, the current element.next, and that's an attribute selection. Actually, the quote should be outside of there. But that way it just could scan along, find the next one, the next one, the next one. And you kind of think about how could I do it optimally? Well, you've got different ways to navigate DOM. You know, you can look for, you can do find, and you can look for next, which will give you the next element right after it. But you can then specify, I only want this kind, because it really depends on how your HTML and your DOM is structured. Because if you have a selector that's too loose, you're going to get a lot of elements. So you've got to think about how to find what you want, and that forces you to think about how do I construct and tag the data to find what you need. So this was another case, like look for the first element in the next row. Well, this is not hard, but you have to think about where you're trying to get to. In this case, you've actually got to come up one level to then go to the next sibling row and then move forward in there. So you kind of have to go up, around, you know, kind of up to the side and then over. And just to see like how some of this is done internally, if you want to, notice this dot first. Well, if you're going to wrap around, like how do you find the right one that's in the first column? Well, I've actually tagged, and you can do this really easy in Angular with the, you know, what is it, $sign first. Actually, you can make sure that you've got classes or attributes in a way that you want that tag your HTML to make it easy to use. So this is another case. You want to go down, like arrow key down. How do you do that? Well, there is no next element. You have to find the one that you want. It means you have to go to the next row, but search for the one with the same column. That's actually not that hard because there are attributes I put on here, column 1, column 2, column 3. So the element can figure out, well, I'm at column 4. Okay, do the navigation we already figured out. Go to the next row, but look for the cell that has an attribute column equals 4. And this basically does that because you're basically pulling out the element's attribute and saying, you know, all this is searching for the next row, but find me the one that's at the right index. So another topic, well, you got to capture the keystrokes. You're working at this higher level now. You know, when you do int repeats and all that, you're really kind of working at an individual, at that individual element level. Well, I needed to capture the keystrokes before it got anywhere further down so that I can then do manipulation, and I'll show you actually how we actually like move the cell marker. It's not really that hard, but you know, within the directive, you've got access to the element that you can call bind, which is JQLite, and you can bind the key down and key press, and you can get the arrow keys. And this is just, you know, basically the case statement for more functionally. Find the key that you want, and then, you know, I've skipped the details, but if you find the arrow key that you want, or the tab key, which in this case too, call the function that will find the next cell and then perform the actions that you want. And then don't forget prevent default, which means the browser won't try to do anything with the arrow keys. Normally it'll try to scroll things back and forth or up and down. Oh yeah, and the comment down here, you have to think about the scope you're working at too when you're capturing, because in this case the element is, it's a sub-element of the whole document, so it depends on where the focus is. So if, in fact, you go to Google Spreadsheets, it'll do this. If you're outside of the spreadsheet, you know, that part doesn't have focus. You type, it's not going to go in there. So you have to think about where you're trying to capture to get the behavior that you want. So rendering this selection band, this thing where you've got a cell or multiple cells that tells you where you're at in the grid. This is pretty classic, right, in the spreadsheet, but how to do it in DOM. So there were a couple of ways, and the first I thought of, which seemed simple, was just alter the display of the divs themselves. each one of these elements, each one of these cells is just a div, you know, and you can change the border or do an inset, you know, various things to color them a certain way. Or you can add more elements on top to then basically create an overlay. So I actually found that trying to manipulate the underlying cells is rather tricky because they have a very particular layout. And if you want to render in a way that doesn't fit within how they're already laid out, you're stuck. Positioning is already fixed. You can't do anything interesting, really. And it's also more challenging to try to do these multi-cell ranges because now you've got to alter a whole bunch of individual cells and figure out where they're at. So really I ended up going with what I'll call overlay rendering, so, which is to have it display on top of a whole different set of elements. And then there's my little comment here about who can remember frame buffers when you actually had real overlay frame buffers. That's how it used to be done. Nobody's, yeah. The old folks, thank you. It's the same concept logic. So, yeah, you just build this stuff up, right? Divs are just little rectangles. So that's what I did. I created this selection band set of elements that's just got a top, left, bottom, and right. They're very thin, and I use the border really to do the display. And it can move around back and forth. And it's really the manipulation of this thing that, well, it's what makes it work. So at this point, though, there's dynamic element creation that's going on in directive. So when that directive is instantiated, it's going to basically insert only one of these, what I'm calling a band. And it's got, you know, top, bottom, left, and right. There's also this little grab box I put in there, kind of like the Google spreadsheets, which is an implement, which you can do, drag and select, have an implemented that. That's next. And then there's this magic here, which is very jQuery-esque, Angular.element with the HTML text. It will instantiate that. And then here it says grid editor element prepend .html. This grid editor element is just a variable that has the actual the element of the directive where it was created. So this band now exists inside of this piece of DOM, and it can be moved around. So you have to alter the properties to actually move it around, and you can do that dynamically. So this is just a function inside that basically finds the two horizontal elements. And this one's interesting because it's nice in jQuery, JQLite if you know that you're trying to, you select the elements that you want. In this case, it's actually going to select two of them, the top and the bottom horizontal bands, because of the way that the classes are set up, and it sets the width then appropriately so it will get longer. And the same thing for that, for one of the right hand, basically the right hand vertical. So it's stretching and contracting this just by altering the display of these divs.
That's a fully variable name there. I've often wanted to set bandwidth.
Set bandwidth?
Yes.
There you go. That'd be nice, right? We can do it.
Is that, where's that code located? Is it in the directive?
It is actually in the directive. I mean, there's a whole bunch of little utility functions I have, and based on the events that are coming in, it will then say, well, it figures out how wide it needs to be, and then it will call this function to then set that width. So this is what it looks like. I'll bring up a live view, but this is what this flat view looks like. These are just the summary. It's not even the editable part, but it's got coloring and click on the row to expand. So now it's the expanded view. Now this is pretty close to a grid, although it has some hierarchy to it. This is where I was talking about, where there's these top level people, and then there's basically projects and tasks, but it's not indented, and hopefully it's a little bit easier to digest. And then here's that band. This little thing, you should really be on the end. I haven't fixed that, and like I said, I'm going to turn this into a select drag. Right now you can actually click to select a whole range. I didn't finish typing this, but I'm going to talk about it real quick before I show you the live demo. So I had a bunch of cases where I needed to communicate back and forth, and there's broadcast and emit. And I started with broadcast a lot just because it seemed like that's what you do. But broadcast goes all the way to the top, or if you start at the top, it'll start where you say, which is like root scope, but it will broadcast all scopes below. Not particularly efficient. In my case, I don't think it was a problem, but in going through the process, I found that it was much better to use emit, which will go up. And what I'm doing in a couple of cases is from a lower level directive, emitting up, catching it in a higher level directive or a controller, and then just stopping it right there. It just kind of makes sense. The other case where I'm trying to communicate across, well, they're a little bit farther removed, is you use root scope basically as a message bus. So you emit in root scope and do a scope.on at the root scope, and it's really just talking up here. It doesn't start going up and down through other scopes. All right, let me pop the demo. All right, so looks like my server's running. So I'm using the arrow keys. I promise I'm using the arrow keys. And it will jump, there we go. And see, and that was the interesting part about having to find the next cell, because I didn't explain it before, but there are these summary cells that are not navigable at all. There's a whole lot of HTML in here that can't be selected, but because the DOM navigation is only looking for a particular thing, and it goes find the next one or go up to the one that makes sense, it'll always find the right one, even if there's other stuff in between. And I tried to make that as generic and declarative as possible so that it would always just work, even if I altered other stuff inside of here. And then, let's see, I can do the click. There we go. And then the part that I was happiest about most recently, about a week ago, was doing that. And then I can do this. And then I can type in a value, and it will update it. And then I can hit plus, and all these neat things that finally are getting to the point where I will probably use it myself. That is my talk and my demo. I haven't implemented that yet, but all those things are percolating in my head, which is, because I'm doing those things now because I'm used to a spreadsheet going, well, I should be able to do a shift, move it over, a shift select band. But the nice thing about behaviors is once you get it working right, you can attach it to any keystroke combination. One thing it's not really that hard, in fact, to attach to everything that you need. Even when you're doing like the, like I've got like a tab to go over and then a shift tab. Well, you have access when you're moving up the keystrokes to the shift key itself, so it's actually pretty straightforward. I started off actually writing it more complicated than it needed to be with looking at is the shift key shifted and then set a variable and then unset it. Turns out if you look at what you're getting returned, you have access to a lot of stuff to implement those things pretty well.
So there's a top level custom directive for the spreadsheet, as it were. Are the rows themselves also custom directives?
Well, they're not. Yes, but I found that I'm not sure that it's really needed, to be honest with you. I've gone back and forth and iterated through a few times. Directives are useful when you've got reuse or really custom stuff. Those, I was going to try to show you like where. So this is the grid navigation directive. It's got a lot of stuff in it. It's doing a lot of things, but it encapsulates it all right here. Once you get, in my case, once I got all that behavior, those little cells, they don't really do a lot. They're just there. The only thing they're really doing is they're bound to the top-level controller, not the directive of the controller, to do the real data binding on the model itself that contains the data. But again, right, it depends on your use case. If I had custom behavior in there that made sense, that was reusable, it makes sense for it to be a directive. What I realized along the way is, there are different kinds of directives. There are those directives that just replace stuff and are like, here, it's going to look a little bit different. It's going to have some custom little layout stuff. This is really a behavioral directive. It's controlling a lot of stuff, and it's manipulating DOM inside of it. So it's kind of this overlay behavior concept.
Had you explored the idea of having your cell navigation really just go back to the data and maybe have a view data version of your data, but it had maybe view elements added onto the data, and then just your keystrokes would manipulate the data, and then just have Angular display that data, like selected, you know, so like a cell is a piece of data, right? And so then if you have a view.
It's not the way that it came out of the evolution of what I built. I started with something that didn't have this, and there's a rather complex data model behind this so that it can handle the edits and the reverts, and then it was bound to the grid elements. And then I put in the behavior on top of it. I mean, it's not that there couldn't be other ways to do it, but in my evolution of building it, I started with the data model being bound in a fairly straightforward way so that it was efficient to these cells, and then added the behavior on top. Anyone else? All right, thanks a lot.